As she saw him, it was again as though she had been punched in the stomach, for she had to realize afresh that she was seeing Charles, and yet it was not Charles at all. Where was Charles Wallace, her own beloved Charles Wallace? What is it I have got that it hasn't got? You have nothing that it hasn't got, Charles Wallace said coldly. How nice to have you back, dear sister. We have been waiting for you. We knew that Mrs. Whatsit would send you. She is our friend, you know. For an appalling moment, Meg believed, and in that moment she felt her brain being gathered up into it. No! She screamed at the top of her lungs. No, you lie! For a moment, she was free from its clutches again. As long as I can stay angry enough, it can't get me. Is that what I have that it doesn't have? Nonsense, Charles Wallace said. You have nothing that it doesn't have. You're lying, she replied, and she felt only anger toward this boy who was not Charles Wallace at all. No, it was not anger. It was loathing. It was hatred, sheer and unadulterated, and as she became lost in hatred, she also began to be lost in it. The red miasma swam before her eyes, her stomach churned in its rhythm. Her body trembled with the strength of her hatred and the strength of it. With the last vestige of consciousness, she jerked her mind and body. Hate was nothing that it didn't have. It knew all about hate. You are lying about that, and you were lying about Mrs. Whatsit, she screamed. Mrs. Whatsit hates you, Charles Wallace said. And that was where it made its fatal mistake. For as Meg said automatically, Mrs. Whatsit loves me. That's what she told me, that she loves me. Suddenly, she knew. She knew. Love. That was what she had that it did not have. She had Mrs. Whatsit's love, and her father's, and her mother's, and the real Charles Wallace's love, and the twins and Aunt Beast's. And she had her love for them. But how could she use it? What was she meant to do? If she could give love to it, perhaps it would shrivel up and die, for she was sure that it could not withstand love. But she, in all her weakness and foolishness and baseness and nothingness, was incapable of loving it. Perhaps it was not too much to ask of her, but she could not do it. But she could love Charles Wallace. She could stand there, and she could love Charles Wallace. Her own Charles Wallace, the real Charles Wallace, the child for whom she had come back to Camazotz, to it, the baby who was so much more than she was, and who was yet so utterly vulnerable. She could love Charles Wallace. Charles, Charles, I love you, my baby brother who always takes care of me. Come back to me, Charles Wallace. Come away from it. Come back. Come home. I love you, Charles. Oh, Charles Wallace, I love you. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was unaware of them. Now she was even able to look at him, at this animated thing that was not her own Charles Wallace at all. She was able to look and love. I love you, Charles Wallace. You are my darling and my dear, and the light of my life and the treasure of my heart. I love you. I love you. I love you. Slowly, his mouth closed. Slowly, his eyes stopped their twirling. The tick in the forehead ceased its revolting twitch. Slowly, he advanced toward her. I love you, she cried. I love you, Charles, I love you. Then suddenly he was running, pelting. He was in her arms. He was shrieking with sobs. Meg, Meg, Meg. I love you, Charles, she cried again, her sobs almost as loud as his, her tears mingling with his. I love you, I love you, I love you. A whirl of darkness, an icy cold blast, an angry, resentful howl that seemed to tear through her. Darkness again. Through the darkness, to save her, came a sense of Mrs. Whatsit's presence, so that she knew it could not be it who now had her in its clutches. And then the feel of earth beneath her, of something in her arms, and she was rolling over on the sweet-smelling autumnal earth, and Charles Wallace was crying out, Meg, oh, Meg! Now she was hugging him close to her, and his little arms were clasped tightly about her neck. Meg, you saved me, he said over and over. Meg, came a call, and there were her father and Calvin, hurrying through the darkness toward them. Still holding Charles, she struggled to stand up and look around. Father, Cal, where are we? Charles Wallace, holding her hand tightly, was looking around too, and suddenly he laughed. His own sweet, contagious laugh. In the twins' vegetable garden, and we landed in the broccoli. Meg began to laugh too, at the same time that she was trying to hug her father, to hug Calvin, and not to let go of Charles Wallace for 1 second. Meg, you did it, Calvin shouted. You saved Charles. I'm very proud of you, my daughter. Mr. Murray kissed her gravely, then turned toward the house. Now I must go in to Mother. Meg could tell that he was trying to control his anxiety and eagerness. Look! She pointed to the house, and there were the twins and Mrs. Murray walking toward them through the long, wet grass. First thing tomorrow, I must get some new glasses, Mr. Murray said, squinting in the moonlight, and then starting to run toward his wife. Dennis's voice came crossly over the lawn. Hey, Meg, it's bedtime. Sandy suddenly yelled, Father! Mr. Murray was running across the lawn, Mrs. Murray running toward him, and they were in each other's arms. And then there was a tremendous happy jumble of arms and legs and hugging. The older Murrays and Meg and Charles Wallace and the twins and Calvin grinning by them until Meg reached out and pulled him in, and Mrs. Murray gave him a special hug all of his own. They were talking and laughing all at once when they were startled by a crash, and Fortinbras, who could bear being left out of the happiness not 1 second longer, catapulted his sleek black body right through the screened door to the kitchen. He dashed across the lawn to join in the joy, and almost knocked them all over with the exuberance of his greeting. Meg knew all at once that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which must be near, because all through her she felt a flooding of joy and of love that was even greater and deeper than the joy and love which were already there. She stopped laughing and listened, and Charles listened too. Hush! Then there was a whirring, and Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which were standing in front of them, and the joy and love were so tangible that Meg felt that if she only knew where to reach, she could touch it with her bare hands. Mrs. Whatsit said breathlessly, Oh, my darlings, I'm sorry we don't have time to say goodbye to you properly. You see, we have to. But they never learned what it was that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which had to do, for there was a gust of wind, and they were gone.